Hey guys, this is Illusion PODFIC, and today we're going to be reading The Heir to Stark Industries by Only Forward. This is Chapter 4. Peter's second time as CEO had been full of success, or at least so people told him. It turned out that in the 2 days Peter had been in charge, he had single-handedly managed to increase productivity by 22% across Stark Industries. He'd increased employee satisfaction significantly, despite its already high level. Stark employees had good things to say about their temporary CEO, and flooded both Tony and Pepper's work email with compliments about Peter. They all stated he had been calm and patient with them, aiding them with their work and listening to the suggestions for the company. In short, they wanted him back. Apparently, him listening to their problems had made them more productive? Tony and Pepper were delighted and had decided to move him up from emergency-only CEO to CEO in training. That was what they were calling it, at least, so that the company wouldn't have to do a press release about their new CEO, which was what Tony thought his role was. Peter disagreed. He was still training. No matter how many meetings he led by himself or changes he enacted, he wasn't a CEO. Not yet. Pepper and Tony privately disagreed. Peter was already a CEO. He didn't need much training to fit into the role. It had taken some getting used to, the idea of being Tony's heir replacing Pepper. Also, apparently it was only a surprise to him. None of the employees who he had spilled the beans to were surprised. Happy had known in advance, as had some of the other Avengers. No one seemed surprised to the new revelation. Even Aunt May knew. She'd signed papers dated several months back. All this time, ever since him becoming an interim director, he was supposed to have been training to be the heir. That was the whole point of the youngboss protocol, not that Peter had understood that. Tony had been almost as concerned about Peter having fainted at the revelation as he had been when Peter had been stabbed that one time. When Peter woke up with a good deal of grogginess, his mentor was holding him in his arms, tapping his face gently and going, "Pete, you with me, kid?" Full dad mode, basically. He and Tony had many chats about the concept of Peter being the heir to the company. Tony's legacy loomed before him. It was terrifying. It was a multi-billion-dollar company that would be placed on his shoulders when he felt ready to take over fully. He had had discussions about it with Pepper as well. Pepper wasn't planning on retiring for a good few years, even though she could obviously retire comfortably as she was. Both of them were planning on helping Peter settle into the new role, and not until he'd lived his teenage and college life to the fullest. It wasn't like Pepper was going to abandon him when he left high school. He would take on partial responsibility, but he still worried. Him being the heir cropped up into the conversation with a fair amount of frequency, often when the other least expected it. "I still can't believe I was supposed to be the heir this whole time," Peter spilled his thoughts one day in their lab session. "And you didn't tell me!" "I thought you knew, kid," Tony had grinned, who was working on one of the Spider-Man suits to increase the tensile strength. "I thought it was obvious." "Not to me," Peter said, attaching the little spider logo to the front of the suit. The logo on the suit doubled as a body camera, which was pretty cool. There were, of course, more deeper and meaningful conversations about it all. Peter would wake up in the dead of the night, scramble for his phone, and dial Tony's number breathless. "I can't do it, Mr. Stark. I can't." Peter was truly woeful, and he would hear as Tony sat up from the bed to talk to him. "What can't you do, kiddo?" he would ask, sounding concerned. Peter's nightmares had returned in greater frequency. The kid had some bad ones about Tony dying, about May dying. It wasn't good. "I can't run Stark Industries, Tony." Peter sobbed into the phone. "I'll sink your company. I'll ruin it. It's all I do. I ruin everything I touch." "Whoa, kid, that is not true." Tony immediately backtracked and refuted the statement with arguments about how the kid did the opposite of what he said, because it was true. Everything Peter touched made the world better, brighter. From Spider-Man to his work at Stark Industries, and especially his contributions during the youngboss protocol, Tony had spoken clearly and calmly, and even managed to ground Peter from his panic attack by talking about meaningless science stuff. Peter fell back into a dreamless sleep afterward. It was crazy the effect Tony could have over the phone. Whenever Peter seemed to have subpar health, be it physical or mental, Tony would turn into even more of a dad than he was normally. Examples being the panic attacks, the stabbing incident, and the most recent one, the fainting incident, as Peter liked to call it. And yet, whilst there had been undoubtable benefits from Peter's second stint as young boss, and his promotion up to heir of the company, there had also, unfortunately, been some repercussions, namely the conversation he'd had with his principal as Peter had dreaded. Peter Parker hated his school principal. Midtown was a reputable school known for having smart students. Smart students were supposed to get internships like the one he'd had at Stark Industries, and yet the school had never believed him. He could get a signed letter from Tony Stark and Pepper Potts themselves, and the school would still never believe him. Hell, Peter was doing college lectures from MIT in his free time. He'd pretty much moved on from Midtown mentally. The only reason he was still around was to graduate with his class, and because he'd feel bad leaving MJ and Ned. The 2 days he'd missed from school to go and be the CEO of a literal billion-dollar company certainly hadn't been detrimental to his education, or a sign of his continued poor behavior, exasperating the situation from the field trips. So that was how he'd found himself in Principal Moriarty's office. His asshole principal, who was chewing him out over his fake internship, and wanted to suspend him for skipping school without permission. He'd only been in the office for 5 minutes and he already wanted to die. I mean, Parker, seriously, take a look at this and tell me it seems real. His principal slid the letter across the desk. Peter had never seen it in his life, because he'd gotten Ava, Pepper Potts' literal assistant, to send it to school when he took the 2 days off to run a company instead of attending what? Like 10 lessons that wouldn't teach him anything? Peter glanced at the letter, written on thick calligraphy paper with a little Stark Industries logo at the top. It read, "To the principal of Midtown Schools of Science and Technology. This is a formal notice to state that the student, Peter Parker, in senior year will be excused from school today, as his presence is required at Stark Industries due to an emergency that is confidential. If you have any questions or concerns, please contact Stark Industries at this email, avaburrows@starkindustries.org. Peter has assured me he will contact his teachers personally to find out what work he has missed out on. Kind regards, Ava, Secretary to Pepper Potts, CEO." Principal Moriarty put both hands on his desk and stared at Peter in the eyes. It felt like an interrogation. "Peter, you have been a student at Midtown High for 4 years now, so you should know perfectly well now that only a parent or guardian can authorize an absence. This letter is not an appropriate form of authorization, and it's unbelievable you thought it would be acceptable. I can't believe you would write a letter like this just to get out of class. My aunt works, and my other listed guardian was deathly ill with a chest infection." Peter defended himself, keeping his voice as light and calm as possible. There was no need to explode at his principal, even if he was extremely infuriating. "It was an emergency. The letter was the only way I could provide immediate clarification. My other guardian—" He was cut off by Moriarty, who flung open the file dramatically. "Oh, and let's check out that other guardian, Moriarty scanned the file with his fingers. "Oh, yes, Tony Stark. Peter, I know you're very intelligent, but who on earth do you think is going to believe that Tony Stark is your guardian?" "I would," came a very familiar voice from the door, and both of them turned to identify the new arrival. And there, of course, was Tony, sunglasses on and leaning on the doorframe. "Oh, wait," Tony pointed at himself. "I'm Tony Stark." "Mr. Stark?" Principal Moriarty was frozen still. Peter was equally surprised. Tony was supposed to be halfway across the country to meet with a bunch of clients. "Tony!" Peter said in shock, dropping the honorific of Mr. Stark. "What? You're supposed to be in California right now." He hissed at Tony, who simply shrugged. "Sorry I'm late, kid. I know May couldn't make it, so she asked me to drop by if I had the time. And good thing I did too, Principal Moriarty." Tony made direct eye contact with the principal. Tony looked furious. "Looks like I'm about to save you from the Parker wrath." Peter put his head in his hands. He was never going to live down that interaction with Colonel Williamson, was he? Tony, of course, then promptly welcomed himself in and sat on the spare chair, placing his sunglasses on Moriarty's desk. "Excuse me?" The principal finally came to his senses, questioning what the Parker wrath was. "Well, you see, Peter here likes to put people in their place almost as much as me, especially when they're being unfathomably stupid. Now, I saved you from Peter. Unfortunately, you get my wrath, which is probably worse considering I'm a concerned guardian rather than a student who respects you." Tony tapped his fingers on the desk, pausing. "I admit, Peter's story does sound like a tall tale, but that doesn't mean you should have immediately dismissed it. We gave you proof, my signature on forms, an official form stating his internship. Honestly, it's believable." Tony raised an eyebrow at Moriarty, waiting for his response. "And why did you feel the right to pull Peter from school?" Moriarty clearly decided to skip over on responding to that whole speech. Peter winced. Tony did not. like it when someone just moved on to a new topic, unresolved. This was about to get vicious. Well, you see, he was recently promoted. Tony sounded so proud, but Peter was internally groaning. It had to be one of the most painful experiences of his life. His principal really didn't need to know about his promotion. Oh? It was a little insulting how Principal Moretti just didn't believe him and sounded so surprised at Peter's success. He was fairly intelligent, after all. See, Peter here is the third in command now. This is all confidential information, of course. And I trust that you won't repeat it. But this boy that you're calling a liar could come down on you with the force of our whole legal team. And I wouldn't stop him. Tony said in a matter-of-fact tone. Peter knew that Tony wasn't bluffing. He genuinely trusted Peter with the table of lawyers after the lawsuit for the whole daily media defamation case had gone through okay, and Stark Industries as well as Tony personally had been paid a significant amount in damages. Third in command? What is that, like he's one of the top 3 interns? Moretti cemented the fact that he was truly an idiot. Peter blinked. Did his principal really think that Tony would make a special trip for just a normal intern? Tony looked at him in disbelief, like he was stupid. No, as in third in command of the company. He ranks below Pepper and I, well, for now at least. Peter shot him a warning glare. They'd had talks about announcing it to the world, that Peter was a new CEO, which he wasn't, as much as Tony boasted he was. He was training. There was a large difference. Tony argued that Peter technically had the same level of command as him, more even. Tony didn't like to get involved with Stark Industries unless he absolutely had to. He trusted Pepper's judgment enough. But Tony continued. We needed Peter to cover over for an emergency. As the letter stated, I was ill and Pepper was dealing with an earthquake. It was complicated. So we got Peter to run the company for a couple of days, and as a trio, we all collectively decided that him missing 2 days of high school wouldn't be detrimental to his education. Principal Moretti blinked and stared at Peter as though he was a stranger. His next speech was stilted and broken. Well, if Peter is still enrolled at Midtown, he has to attend classes. And his guardian has to sign the slip next time, not some random secretary. I'll sign the slip next time, Tony grinned. Peter stared at the wall, wanting to die, trying to block his mind from all the possibilities. It was Tony. Literally anything could happen. So you are his guardian. Moretti had turned back from looking uncomfortable to looking like he was going to have a panic attack. All of his worst fears coming true. Peter tried to take the look on his principal's face and superimpose it onto Flash's. He'd never see Flash's reaction, of course, because they'd be announcing Peter's position as the heir after he graduated, and he planned on never seeing Flash again after graduation. But it was a nice thought, seeing Flash's world toppling down as it was revealed that, actually, Peter had only been telling the truth, and withholding most of it. Yes, as we stated over a year ago, I'm one of his guardians. Tony cocked his head at Moretti. If you leak this to the media, we will know, by the way. I'm getting someone to send over an NDA as we speak. Sorry, but we've had issues with the people before. Peter thought of Alex and everyone at the Daily Media and winced again. Well, Moretti said, sounding extremely worn out. In all due respect, Principal Moretti, Peter doesn't need to be here anymore. Tony took a small breath and Peter worried. Oh God, if Tony started flexing about Peter... You could ask him any question from any class and I guarantee he would get them right. This kid is a genius, and the only reason he isn't already at MIT is because when I graduated early, I was miserable. Missing 2 days of school isn't going to ruin his future. He's not skipping school when he leaves, Mr. Moretti. He's going to work. And that's what you're trying to encourage these kids to do eventually. Leave school, get a degree, find a smart job in a tech company. It's not Pete's fault that he's so smart that he gets to fast-track the process. Oh God, how embarrassing. He was just a tiny bit proud, though. Peter never liked it when anyone complimented him, but Tony complimenting him on his scientific prowess was different. It felt good, nice, fatherly. Needless to say, they walked out of Midtown without Peter being suspended or even punished at all, and Moretti's NDA in hand. Peter just wished he wouldn't have to return to the school on Monday morning, and try and desperately avoid Moretti for the month he had left of senior year. After the fight Tony and Peter had with the principal to keep him from being wrongfully suspended, things had settled again. Peter was used to doing certain jobs that extended beyond the role of intern director, including completely setting up the intern fair in conjunction with that one employee from HR, and being in charge of the whole comfort room idea, as he was the one who had originally implemented it. It felt good to be in control of things. He found himself glad that it wasn't only the Young Boss protocol that he got to be important and help people. Peter left pretty much all the meetings to Pepper, unless the military tried to open their mouths again for another meeting. When it had been announced to the military that all other meetings would be led by Peter, the military pretty much went silent. Rhodey had told Tony that there is a new general rule across the U.S. military that had been passed across by word of mouth. Do not mess with the young Stark, aka Peter Parker. Tony found it hilarious, but Peter had grown when he'd heard that. Seriously, did Colonel Williamson have to leave him a whole fucking legacy for the entire U.S. military? Whilst things had settled, it didn't mean things had been easy. Issues with the Accords had surfaced, and there had been more Avengers activity than in the past few months. Combined with Tony's dedication to certain lab projects that had unofficial deadlines, as well as his long recovery from that particularly bad chest infection, his mentor was exhausted. What did Tony do when he was exhausted? He would spend more time in the lab, of course, working on things he didn't need to work on. Peter didn't need more efficient web shooters that even have elastic tasers in them, just in case, Pete. These needless inventions were Tony's distraction from his looming need to sleep at night. Pepper was equally exhausted from the new construction in Tokyo, as the city had recovered extremely well and quickly from the earthquake, to launch a new branch of Stark Industries, as well as problems within the Hong Kong department. She'd been flying around the world without much of a break. Peter had watched her in a few meetings they'd been in together over the last few weeks, and she'd clearly been tired. It had been breaking his heart to watch two of his most favorite people in the whole world be so worn down. If it had been May, he would have offered to do the housework for a week and give her a break. But whenever Peter tried to step in for Pepper or Tony, they rejected his help, telling him to focus on schoolwork and that they had it under control. So Peter decided to stage an intervention for the two of them. The Young Boss protocol was strictly for emergencies only, Tony had said, but they'd moved on from that. Young Boss was no longer about Peter replacing Tony and Pepper when there was no one else. He'd proved his worth. He was an heir now, the heir. He was a CEO in training, and he could hold his own against the way to Stark Industries for a week or two while Pepper and Tony went on holiday. He proposed the idea to them over breakfast one weekend, Friday on standby in case he needed to prove his statements. Peter took a breath and then launched into it. Mr. Stark, you haven't slept in 96 hours. Tony quirked his eyebrows at the statement. Yes, I had Friday monitor you. Don't ask questions. And no, falling asleep at the lab table that one time doesn't count. You woke up 5 minutes later. That is not sleep. That's passing out. Peter scolded Tony. I know you have things to do, but doing them instead of sleeping is actually the opposite of productive. You need to rest. Tony looked sheepish. But Peter cut him off, turning his attention to Pepper. And respectfully, Miss Potts, I think you need to take a break as well. You've been exhausted for weeks, ever since Japan, and you haven't taken a solid holiday in 3 years. Please, just hear me out. Pepper opened her mouth and closed it again. Good. They weren't going to try and defend themselves. Anywhere. Go literally anywhere. You go to Maine, Australia, Latvia, as long as you both agree to do no work while you're there. For Stark Industries or the UN. Both Tony and Pepper looked at him like he was crazy. No, don't look at me like that. You both deserve a break, and you're not going to grant yourselves one, so I'm doing it. They were both clearly taken aback. Technically, Peter had the right to at least suggest the break because of his position, but with the both of them gone, it would mean that the Young Boss protocol would have to return. Peter would be solely in charge. Pete, we promised you that the Young Boss protocol would only be for emergencies, Tony said gently. We can't abuse that to go on a holiday. Tony, with all due respect, it's not about the Young Boss protocol. This is my future. Doing it for an extra week doesn't hurt. You made me the heir. This is me taking initiative. You trust me, right? Peter was adamant about this. Tony and Pepper would have a break, no matter what. He would make them agree. They'd go crazy if they didn't. He was sure of it. Kid, of course I trust you. If Pepper wanted to resign, I'd pass the company to you in a heartbeat. I wasn't dissing your capabilities, more the fact that we'd be taking a week out of your last month of senior year in high school. You'll be running this company for years if all goes well, but you only get 1 more month of high school. Guardians, so dramatic. May was saying the same thing, talking about things coming to an end. as if he'd be sad to leave Midtown. All it had brought him was a good deal of teasing, people calling him a liar, one best friend who wasn't going to leave him, and a friend. MJ was complicated. Friend didn't feel right. Not really. Not from the conversations they'd been having about life and the future after high school. He was teetering on the edge of telling her about Spider-Man. Anyways, Peter wasn't sad about the end of his high school career. That was the point. Ugh, Mr. Stark, Peter complained. I've done my finals. They're not even teaching us anymore. Just talking about college and the future and of graduation. I'm ready to go. I've got college sorted and my future. I'd prefer to miss the week, honestly. He would. Anything to avoid a week of Flash's taunts, but there was no point getting into all of that. I think we should talk to May about this. Peter glanced at Tony. Isn't it something we should be doing, Peter, just so we can have a holiday? Y'all need a break. I do have one request, though. Is it okay if I schedule one day off and run Stark Industries remotely for the Wednesday? We have my surprise school field trip, and I think I need to be there. MJ said she'd kill me if I do my Parker thing again. Peter rolled his eyes. Apparently, people notice when I run off by myself during field trips. Oh, and I think you might need to sign me off for the week, Mr. Stark. Don't worry about my signature. Tony grinned like a shark. I've got that sorted. Okay, now Peter was worried. Nothing good ever came out of the smile like that, especially from Tony. But it seemed like he'd gotten Mr. Stark on board, which is a positive sign, even if it did mean letting him wreak havoc on Principal Moretti as a way to bribe himself into thinking it was a good idea. So, if I talk to May and she's okay with it, I'm good to go? Peter asked, bouncing on his heels. This was going to work. Only if she's okay with it. Pepper checked, holding up his finger pointed at him. I'll go talk to her, promise. Start booking hotels. Peter called out to them as he ran back to the lab. He had some web fluid bubbling, and he didn't want to leave it too long. Later that Saturday, he got May's permission, and then it was set. A week of leading Stark Industries, and more importantly, a week of Tony and Pepper actually having a holiday for the first time in probably years. They decided to go to a small island in the Caribbean. Very private, warm, quiet residence. Peter had bought them coconut cups to drink cocktails out of. He was extremely excited to get pictures, and even more excited to be left in trust of the company. There was only a few things he had to do before he started. He'd promised Ned he'd hang out with them on Sunday. They were mid-completion of a mega Harry Potter Hogwarts build, a birthday present for Ned from Tony back in November. But they'd been busy with the Star Wars builds, and only found the time to complete it after finals were over. They spent the day putting blocks together and talking about the end of high school, college, MJ, the field trip, and of course, his impending week. Have they flown out yet? Yep, Peter said, checking his watch. Flight left at 9:52. Tony said he'd text when they landed. Dang, that's cool. I wish I could fly in a private jet, Ned chuckled. Peter didn't think he had a private jet, but there was no telling with Tony. He was very vividly remembering the time he'd asked for a Netflix account, and Tony actually bought him the company. Apparently, Tony had already owned it, having bought it years ago, because he'd seen the potential in it, and technically just switched the ownership over to Peter. Tony said he'd left the employees of Netflix to do what they wanted. He had no real input. Peter hadn't mentioned the switchover to anyone, especially May, but it had meant that all of his favorite films were on Netflix, so that was a plus. The CEO of Netflix had asked him if Peter had wanted to do anything differently, and Peter had been so overwhelmed that he just told him to keep doing what he'd been doing before, like with Tony. Occasionally, he'd send the man a text asking for a certain series or film, and try not to think about the fact that it was actually his company. Too big to comprehend. But he didn't think Tony had bought him a private jet. His 18th birthday was coming up, though, August 10th. And there was always the possibility. Maybe he could give it to Ned. Peter really didn't need a plane. They tinkered a little bit with the Lego before Ned encroached another subject. Excited about next week? Yeah, I think so. It's not much different to normal, just a couple more meetings. Gotta speak to the board members and staff on Monday, and then I have the big meeting with the UN that Tony was supposed to do, and the Accords on Tuesday. Peter shrugged. I'm a bit nervous for that, I guess. But then I get to go on the field trip on Wednesday. Were they okay with that, you taking the day off? Ned asked, fixing a piece of Lego to the build and glancing at him. Yeah, and I said if there were any emergencies, I would just step out. Honestly, SI doesn't need a CEO. I just fix problems and make stuff better occasionally. They'd be perfectly efficient without me there, and both Pepper and Tony know that well enough. So yeah, they were fine with it, to be honest. I think they just wanted to have a break. Peter fiddled with the tassels on his hoodie, or rather, Tony's. One time he'd arrived at the lab with just a t-shirt on, and the lab was cold. When Tony saw that Peter was shivering, he chucked one of his old hoodies at the teenager without looking at it. And it was his old MIT hoodie. Peter never had given it back. Awesome, Ned whispered, mostly to himself. They continued to build the magnificent sculpture as it was coming together, and chatted about everything, from ideas of where the field trip could be to talking about colleges. There were several things Peter had to do before he could crack on with the day, early on Monday morning, having taken inspiration from Pepper's morning routine, and of course, combining a little bit of Tony's in there. Pepper spent at least half an hour in her office reading the news and studying the state of the U.S. economy for fluctuations, in order to keep on top of the scandals and the changes in the market. It was apparently useful for business decisions. Peter didn't like to read, and especially not early in the morning, so he put his own spin on it. He decided that his way of incorporating that into his day would be to wander into Tony's lab and start tinkering on one of the suits. It was always good to keep the lab alive whilst Tony was away on holiday. Apparently the bots got lonely if Tony was away too long. Peter could understand that. The lab was kind of lonely without his mentor running around. Then, when he was settled in his lab, he had Friday play what was essentially a newsreel from all the semi-trustworthy news presenters of that morning, hearing all the top stories. That was his adaptation of Pepper's suggestion that he get caught up on current events. And it meant he didn't even have to read anything. The final thing to check before Peter could get to work was that Tony had sent in the slip excusing Peter from being in class. Truth be told, Tony did have the signature sorted. A very distinct signature. There was no way anyone could deny that Tony Stark had signed Peter a permission slip of absence. It was unmissable. Tony had commissioned a paper company to create the largest piece of paper ever made. And yes, he got another Guinness World Record just for that, and wrote the letter on paper in extremely small writing, and had then signed it in the biggest possible letters. You could see the T. Stark signature from the window from a plane. The paper covered the entire football field. There were rumors that Principal Moretti had resigned after he saw the second part of the signature, that Tony denied ever having ordered. His eye had twitched when he denied it, though. There was, naturally, a plane that had accompanied the paper. Peter never saw the plane because, of course, he was absent. But Ned had sent him a picture, so now the image of a plane banner reading, "Suck my dick," had now become a part of Midtown history. The great news was, all of the students just thought it was a prank that someone had done just because they knew Moretti had issues with Tony Stark. It had also been rumored that a day after the meeting Moretti had had with Tony and Peter, Moretti had purchased a dartboard with Tony's face on it, and stuck it on the inside of his office door. Tony was delighted when he'd heard about it. So the students of Midtown didn't bother to read the letter, because they figured it was just an elaborate prank set by some student to enrage Moretti. There wasn't much to say about Monday. It went smoothly. The board of directors approved of all the minute changes that had been made since the last meeting. Peter was glad and went on with the day attending the other meetings and sorting out minor issues. He didn't particularly fancy being almost shot in the head again, so he mainly stuck to his areas at Stark Tower, which basically meant he went in a triangle from his office to the meeting rooms and to R&D. He'd planned to go out Spider-Manning every evening to keep a routine up, which he did on Monday to keep him fit. The fighting, and even the swinging was pretty good to give some fresh air. There were a couple of muggings, but nothing of significant importance. Tuesday was minorly more important. As he discussed briefly with Ned, the UN were kicking off again, this time to do with the Accords. It was Tony's specialty, and Tony who dealt with them. It had been one of the major reasons Tony had been reluctant to go away that week. None of the other Avengers had the balls to speak to the UN in the way Tony did so abrasively to get what he wanted. So Peter had decided to take it over just for the one meeting. Tony had told them, essentially, to stall. He didn't want any of the UN suggested measures put in place while he was on holiday, and Peter was very good at stalling. Once he'd taken one of the meetings with the U.S. military and had lasted 4 hours because whenever the clients tried to input their ideas, which was essentially just for Stark Industries to make weapons again, Peter would just talk over them about the current contract for energy supplies. He knew all of the energy contracts in enough detail to talk for a very long time. After 4 hours, of course, the military individuals had gotten frustrated and left, leaving Peter triumphant. So stalling was a concept he was very used to, and that was what he did on Tuesday in a meeting with the UN before going out to Spider-Man to finish off the evening. He'd of course prearranged things so that his surprise field trip would be able to take place without any problems. Peter could control Stark Industries from wherever museum or science institute they found themselves at, even if it did mean he'd have to take a step out every so often to take some calls. Mr. Harrington was understanding, and generally oblivious. He wouldn't ask for context, probably wouldn't notice Peter slip off if any calls came up. When Wednesday finally swung around, Peter woke up in the tower, going through his early morning routine, and thought about skipping the field trip. It was exciting, true, but field trips had never gone well for him. That one time he'd got bitten by a radioactive spider, of course, and then his incident at Washington, needless to say, he was a bit on edge. And this one was a mystery. Pete didn't like the concept of that. Ned, however, was hyped. He loved surprises and had spent the entire ride from Midtown babbling at Peter about what he'd missed from the 2 days of school. Apparently, not much, other than various pieces. The only semi-interesting thing that had happened had been Tony Stark's signature appearing on the football field, and that had been Monday morning. Peter had his eyes shut during the duration of the coach ride. They always made him feel ill. There were just too many sensory inputs, everyone's conversations, the creaking of the old coach, someone chewing gum several aisles back. It was easier if he took one of those senses away and just shut his eyes. But when he felt the coach pull to a stop and whispers start to circulate, he got tapped on the shoulder extremely rapidly by Ned. Dude! Peter opened his eyes reluctantly, already ready for the day to be over. When he said he'd wanted to go on the field trip, he'd forgotten just how insufferable most of the members of his year group actually were to be around. It was too much to be trapped in a coach with his senior year. Flash, too, another issue. He'd sent Peter a warning glare that morning, and Peter did not want to see what Flash had planned for him, not on a field trip like this. Welcome to the destination of your senior field trip, Stark Industries, Mr. Harrington announced, and Peter shot up in his seat, adjusting to the environment. No, he whispered, the world crashing around him before his feet. He turned to Ned with a look of horror. His best friend's face, however, was thrilled. Of course, Peter knew that Stark Industries offered tours to high schools. It was part of the HR initiative to attempt to get more people interested in the company, especially youths. Peter had helped with it, explaining things that he thought would appeal to the youths. Hell, Peter had helped plan half of the tour, choosing what interns would do demonstrations for the kids. And yes, he had known there would be several tours for the week he was in charge. It had come up in one of the bulletins Friday had given him, but he hadn't thought to look at the schools. He wasn't expected to interact with the tours, having had a busy week planned around meetings and more important things, aka not tour groups. So naturally, he didn't expect his senior school trip to be to Stark Industries. But of course, it was. He should have called in sick, both from the field trip and from work. He should have advocated his position as CEO, if that was the thing CEOs could do. He should have pleaded to fly with Tony and Pepper to their holiday just to avoid the field trip. He'd known field trips never went well for him. Shit. The realization was setting in. His senior year field trip was going to be at what was currently his company. Peter was going to be spending the day touring the building, meeting employees, not as Peter Parker, the training CEO, not Peter Parker, their boss, but as Peter Parker, the high school student. And one word, fuck. There was a general flurry of excitement as the group got off the coach, but Peter's emotions were in overdrive. Okay, there was just no way. There was no way this had happened organically. Someone had to have intervened on this. Peter's mind was turning very quickly, trying his hardest not to go into a panic attack. So he called Tony. He needed to get to the bottom of this. Peter! Tony was grinning. Peter could tell even through the phone something about the inflection of his voice. He was probably chilling by the pool, drinking out of coconut. How's your morning? It is morning there, right? Yes, and it's going bad, Mr. Stark. My morning is going very badly. Peter hissed at his mentor. He was trying to be subtle, sort of whispering into the phone so no one could hear. He and Ned were at the back of the pack of the kids as they walked towards the car park of the tower, which was fairly vast for the center of New York. Do we need to come back? Tony sounded worried. We can be back in 12 hours tops, if you need me, or Pepper, either of us. No, stay. It's not really work-related problems. Peter sighed. Do you know anything about my field trip? Or, does Pepper? He felt bad for asking, but if Tony had arranged this... Kid, why would we have anything to do with your field trip? But Tony sounded genuinely confused. Where is it anyways? You sounded excited when you asked for the day off. And you must be there by now. Is it worth taking the day off? Tony, it's a tour of Stark Industries. Peter dropped into first-name basis to complain. The other line was quiet for a moment, stunned into silence, and then Tony burst into laughing. Kid, you have the worst look, I swear. What? So your long-awaited end-of-high-school field trip is... Peter interrupted, still hissing at Tony. Yes, it's very funny, Tony. I'm about to do a tour of the building I'm currently CEO of. Wow. Tony was clearly wiping away tears of laughter, still chuckling. Wait until Pepper hears. Have you seen Happy yet? He'll be so surprised. Oh my god, I said you weren't in today. Happy would probably see him, but that would be the least of his problems. All the employees knew him. If not personally, then at least his face. Even wearing a hoodie and jeans, he'd still be reasonably recognizable. So did I, Mr. Stark. I'm going to have to hide so people don't find out. I know literally 90% of the employees. I'm screwed. Well, you could just own it, Tony said. The announcement is only in a few weeks, after all. We'd have to get your class to sign NDAs, but I'd be okay with it. True, Peter could just own it. He could stroll into the building like a boss and be, in fact, the boss. He could abandon the tour, steal Ned and MJ, and just go and spend the day in the labs doing what he wanted. Or something more productive. Something where he wouldn't run into the tour group. But he'd have to speak to Mr. Harrington and explain the situation, and he really didn't want to do that. He didn't want his class to know, and he definitely didn't want to see the expression on Flash's face when it came out that he was, in fact, Peter Parker, CEO of Stark Industries. Not Penis Parker, the pathetic high school student. In theory, it would be funny seeing Flash's reaction. But actually, Peter thought he might get decked by Flash if he exposed himself as the actual CEO. No, Mr. Stark, it's really not worth it. I'll just be conspicuous. Easier said than done. Good luck with that, kid. If you need anything... Tony trailed off. Yeah, I'll ring. Thanks. You've got this, kiddo. Peter hung up and immediately turned to Ned. I need your hat. Ned had been donning this baseball cap for the past week, non-stop. It was his new favorite hat, black, inconspicuous, and it looked good on everyone. He was extremely attached to it. No, dude, Ned immediately protested, gripping onto his hat. This is my comfort hat. You can't. It's life or death, Ned. If any of them find out, I'm screwed. Okay, Ned sighed, handing over the hat. But if you lose it... It was a weak threat at most. Ned would never do anything to Peter. I know. Feeling a little more reassured, Peter put on the hat. That is what all the Avengers did to hide their identity, right? Put on a hat and a hoodie and pray no one looked at your face. Peter reluctantly entered the tower with his head down. It was Will at the front desk, a guy he was fairly well acquainted with. He immediately beelined for the employee, trying his best to make it look natural and normal. Mr. Harrington was busy talking to the other lady at the front desk, presumably to get their badges and find out where to find the tour guide. Peter knew how the access system to Stark Tower went. All employees had badges with their varying access levels encoded into the system. Friday recognized most higher-ups, including him. If Peter forgot his name badge, which he often had, then Friday would simply let him in anyways, same as Tony or Pepper. Trying to get Tony to wear a name badge was futile anyways. His badge, which he had in his bag in case there was an actual emergency mid-field trip, which apparently wouldn't be a problem anymore because he was actually in the building, was largely irrelevant. It gave him all access, of course, as the CEO, but he didn't actually need it. But it would flash up with his access code when he went through the sensor, which he didn't need. No one from his class, besides Ned and probably MJ, would believe that Peter had access everywhere as an intern. Hell, they didn't believe he even had an internship. So he went up to Will, cap on, and looked up, making a shush action with his finger. Will, I need you to do something for me. Will looked surprised at seeing Peter on his day off, and especially in normal clothes, but responded immediately. God, Peter loved his employees. Anything, boss? Will hesitated. Are you undercover? This is my school. Peter gestured to the group subtly. They're doing a tour group and they don't know anything. I'd like to keep it that way. Let me go last, yeah? The scanner would still go off, proclaiming him all access, but if he was the last, then hopefully less people would pay attention to it. Sure thing, but I can't stop the scanner from coming up as all access for you, Will warned. That's fine. As long as you get them to congregate far away once they're through the scanner, no one should pick up on it. Hopefully it would work. Okay, will do. Will gave him a thumbs up. Good luck, boss. Thanks, Will. I'm gonna need it. Peter was disrupted by his teacher. Parker, what are you doing? Mr. Harrington scolded him, calling Peter back over to the group. We have to listen to this. It's important stuff about security here. Well, Peter thought. He was pretty sure he knew more about security at Stark Towers than Mr. Harrington did, but sure, he listened to the talk. Will then did his whole speech about how important it was to wear badges at Stark Industries. Peter could attest at least to that. It wasn't worth seeing Happy's face when he didn't wear the badge. There's varying levels of access depending on your role here. You guys get temporary access for the day as you're on tour. Different employees get different access. Will pointed to his badge. I get medium access because I work part-time as an intern. Part-time down here, but I can't go into all the departments or the meeting rooms up top. Pepper Potts, for example, would have all access. Will's eyes flickered to Peter out of habit when he said that, but he immediately shifted away to glance at the sensor. I'm going to read out your names and you can come up and get your badge, then go through the sensor, which will register you, and then if you could please form in a group over by the office there. Will gestured to the room which the tour guides had adopted as their office, which had previously been a spare room. Your tour guide will meet you there. Peter nodded slightly. Good. It was a good distance away from the sensor. He should be safe from suspicion. Okay, Mr. Roger Harrington, if you go first. Mr. Harrington grabbed his badge with enthusiasm and went through the sensor, which made a beep and stated, Roger Harrington, temporary access. Will started off the students in alphabetical order, starting with Betty Brant. Peter, of course, was in the middle of the register, but Will would hold him back. Peter was pretty sure. Peter hated the school register. Ned and MJ, having similar surnames, were next to each other, so they got to go through the scanner pretty much together. MJ glanced at him before going to pick up her badge. Cool hat, Peter. She smiled, and Ned looked appalled. Of course, now it was Peter wearing the hat that people complimented it. Geez, people these days. Peter smiled back at MJ. Michelle Jones, temporary access. MJ wandered through over to where Mr. Harrington had now collected half the class. Ned was buzzing as Will read out his name and grinned at Peter as he went to collect his badge. Ned had never been to Stark Industries before. They tended to hang out either at Peter's apartment or Ned's place. He kept his work and school life separate. But from Ned's reaction to just being in the entrance area, he probably should have brought his best friend to the tower. Peter had the right to, after all, as boss, and Ned would freak if he saw the personal labs. Ned leads, temporary access. Ned glanced back at Peter, who gave him a thumbs up, and then he went to catch up with MJ. There were several other names before Peter's name should have been called, because God had wanted to smite him. He and Flash were in similar places on the register, so when the name Eugene Thompson was called, Flash glared at him with a sentiment of confusion before turning to Will and picking up his badge. Thankfully, Flash didn't say anything about Peter being skipped on the register. More students passed by until they reached the end of the register, and Will glanced at Peter. Oh, sorry, Mr. Parker, I must have skipped you, Will said, for the benefit of Flash, who was still near to the sensor, having waited for a friend of his who had the surname Wilson. He crossed his fingers behind his back and closed his eyes as he went through the scanner, waving his Peter Parker CEO in Training badge at the sensor. Peter Parker, all access. Welcome back, Peter. Thanks, Fry, he whispered, and then opened his eyes again. It had worked. Flash, who was probably just out of hearing range, hadn't heard a thing. He gave a double thumbs up to Will, who just smiled and returned to his desk. Okay, that problem was out of the way then. Crisis averted. The tour guide had surfaced by the time Peter joined up with the group, shuffling in between Ned and MJ, hat covering his face. Tour guides varied. Most of them were interns, but some people came from other departments. Either way, he'd need to avoid the tour guide at all costs, or speak to them privately like he'd done with Will. It turned out that the tour guide was Kai from HR. He was knowledgeable about all things Stark Industries and had applied to be a tour guide shortly after the whole Alice incident from Peter's previous experience as young boss. Peter himself had approved the training because Kai was nice enough and probably deserved a break after sitting with him and the legal team for about an hour. Personally, Peter didn't think tours would be relaxing, but hey, probably more relaxing than doing interviews of new deputies for Mrs. Roberts and hoping these ones wouldn't, in fact, be attempted murderers intent on shutting down the company. But hey, every job has its faults. Hi guys, I'm Kai, and I'm your tour guide for today. Kai waved at them all. I'm going to be showing you around Stark Industries. The tour will start with showing you the arc reactor, the pride and joy of Stark Industries. Then we'll move on to the museum, etc., etc. The class collectively nodded and started whispering. Right, let's make a move then. Oh, and if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask me. Dude, Ned grinned at Peter, whispering, this is so cool. I can't believe you're the CEO right now. That's crazy. Peter raised his eyes in alarm, glancing around. MJ was walking slightly ahead. She knew about the internship, but she was under the impression that he was still only one of the most important interns, who worked personally with Mr. Stark. Peter had accidentally let that one slip, but he decided he wasn't going to mention the whole, Heir thing to her until just before the announcement. The less people who knew, the better. MJ had probably figured it out anyways. Volume, Peter reminded Ned, but yeah, it's pretty cool. He tried to look at the corridors like someone who'd never seen them would. It probably would be cool to someone who hadn't worked there for multiple years, but hey, Peter had seen the inside of Tony's lab, the Avengers compound, and even Bruce Banner's personal lab. Nothing could quite compare to seeing stuff like that. The arc reactor was largely self-sufficient. Technically, it didn't keep the tower going with the electricity it produced, but there were several other smaller ones, like the ones in Tony's suit, that did more to keep the building running. But the large arc reactor, before Tony started to work on a miniaturized one, was more impressive, which is why it had been left at the bottom of the tower. It was like a piece of history of Stark Industries. Kai did talk about the history of the arc reactor and what it did for the building. Peter was itching to explain that it was actually not that efficient as it was advertised, and in fact was very much too big to still have at the company. But size meant power to a lot of people, so Peter left it. Besides, he was supposed to be under the radar. After about 15 minutes of wonder and general awe from his classmates, Kai decided to move them along, and so they left the arc reactor behind. Next, we have the Stark Industries Museum. Kai informed them when they were several floors up. Now, Peter knows about the museum, but he'd never actually visited it. He knew it contained such things as old Avengers weapons and suits, when Tony didn't have anywhere else to put them. He also knew that the museum showcased several Stark Industries inventions, but he'd never been too interested in the history of it all. Everything he needed to know, he knew. Peter underestimated the museum. He thought it would just be a small room with several displays, but it had to be the size of a fairly large conference room, actually. On one wall, there was the Avengers display, which had an array of Iron Man suits, from a replica of the first one up to some of the more recent ones, which was pretty cool. And wait. There was one of the old Spider-Man suits on the wall, the one he'd fought Captain America with. Holy shit, that was where it had gone. Tony had given him a replacement without commenting on it, but it had ended up here? In the museum? That was so cool. He and Ned immediately beelined for it. That's so cool, man, Ned whispered to him. You're in a museum! It was pretty cool. They wandered along the display, seeing all the Avengers' various weapons, and Peter would occasionally point at something and give an anecdote of a time he'd fixed them in the lab, like one of Hawkeye's bows or the Falcon wings. And then, of course, the main attraction, the History of Iron Man display. It's crazy how big the suits used to be, one of his classmates commented as they stared at the first ever Iron Man suit, which was technically a replica because obviously Obadiah Stane had wrecked the first one. I've heard Tony gets his suit from a watch now. Nanotechnology, another commented, is pretty cool. Peter uncomfortably shifted his own watch on his wrist, which had a backup Spider-Man suit in it, just in case. As Tony's technology had worked so well for his suit, they'd figured out how to make a replica of the Iron Spider suit for the watch. It was a more recent change, but it was a much more functional watch than, say, a Rolex. There was also a display showing the history of Stark phones, back from when Howard had initially designed a phone which looked like a brick, in comparison to the modern Stark phones. Peter wandered over to have a look at how they progressed over the years. It was pretty cool because he could compare it to the most recent versions, which wasn't even out to the general public yet. The Stark Phone XI is being released in like 3 months, right? Betty asked Kai. I heard it's supposed to have some super cool features on it. It was 4 months, actually, Peter mentally corrected. The new Stark phone was beyond any of the others the company had created, and Peter was pretty proud of it because of some of its contributions. Yes, and I might know a bit about that, Kai grinned, but I'm afraid I'm sworn to secrecy until they showcase the next phone. Do you have one? Flash asked Kai. Do the employees get Stark phones? No, employees don't get the newest gen for free, but we do get a significant discount. And we get a free Stark phone from an older gen. We've had issues with the employees selling their new Stark phones, so the initiative had to stop. Now the phones are kept until the release date. Almost no one gets a copy of the new phone. Ironically, Peter's phone buzzed in his pocket at that point, and it felt like a burning hole in his trousers. Of course, he had a copy of the newest generation, the Stark phone XI, as did Tony and Pepper. No one could know that he had one, of course, but it was pretty cool, with the hologram feature for calling people. He moved away from the history of Stark phones to look at some of the smaller inventions. There was a display on the wall with light boxes showing the inventions on a large timeline from the creation of the company. Peter wandered along, staring at all of Howard's inventions, and all the ones that were credited in Tony's name. It was cool to see the diversity in inventions after 2008, when it shifted from mainly weapons to a wider range of industries. It went straight from the Jericho missile 2008 to the miniaturized arc reactor 2008. Peter's eyes went wide when he got to the end of the timeline. His medical bandaging was there amongst all the other things he had worked on, and he was credited for them. Holy shit! He had no idea he was in the museum, not even as Spider-Man, but also as Peter Parker. Peter glanced around. All of the most recent inventions have been credited with the names of several of the interns, but also tacked on the end was his initials, his surname P. Parker, even ones he'd helped with only just slightly. Wow, that was so cool. After many of the students marveled at the wonders of the Iron Man suits and posed for pictures with them, including Ned, despite having actually met Tony Stark before, Peter abstained from any photos. He spent his days working on the new and improved versions of the suits. Hell, he'd even flown one before. He didn't need a photo with them. But he did get a nice selfie with Ned and MJ, which he made a mental note to print out at some point. It was one for the scrapbook. Next, we'll go to the canteen so you guys can get some lunch, Kai informed them. It's on this floor. The elevator took them down to the correct floor, and the class collectively followed Kai and wandered along the corridor to the canteen. Kai stopped at a very familiar door. Well, as we're here, I guess we should go into the comfort room. This was a recent decision by, Kai paused, realizing the public didn't know about Peter being CEO yet. A person in charge, who decided that the company needed to hire a private therapist. According to him, this room just happened. The comfort room was one of Peter's pride and joy areas at Stark Industries, and it was nice to see the collective excitement of his class when they saw it. If R&D was Peter's baby of sorts, then this area had to be his niece or nephew. It had blossomed over the time Peter had constructed it, and was now a fully fledged room. The therapist, Emily, was actually in a session when the tour group entered the room, but his classmates appreciated the room itself. Betty crowded the fishbowl and began to peek at the fish, which had all been named after the Avenger. Their color scheme matched. Peter was particularly proud he could identify each fish by name, but they didn't like him as much as they liked Emily. Several other students gravitated to the beanbags. Flash, however, centered around the PlayStation Peter had installed. This is a PS6. Flash glanced at the system. How? We're Stark Industries, Kai said, and didn't elaborate. Peter grinned. The company got special compensation for game systems and new technology, which Peter had taken advantage of to get the earliest adaptation of the new PlayStation system. They'd actually produced a game about superheroes, which is pretty cool, but not as cool as actually swinging through New York itself. Dude, Ned punched him lightly. This is awesome. Thanks, Peter smiled back. It was nice to be acknowledged for his handiwork. Finally, they arrived in the canteen area. Peter didn't expect a range of gasps when the group arrived in the Stark Industries canteen, but he guessed it was a group of teenagers' heaven. A bunch of random fast food places gathered in one open location, like a mall, and a company building. Peter didn't care for a burger or pizza. He always had and always would get his sandwich for lunch. So whilst the group dispersed to get their free lunch, he went straight for Delmar's, Ned following. Mr. Delmar's son recognized him immediately and gave him a thumbs up before Peter even had to order. I got it, kid. Don't even worry. Wow, Ned muttered. You're friends with the cafeteria guy as well. Is there anyone you don't know? Peter chuckled. Probably. What are you going to get for food? Ned stared at all the shops and focused on a pizza joint. I might go and grab a pizza. Meet at one of the tables? Yeah, Peter nodded. I'm gonna sit down by the table over there to be conspicuous, avoid the employees. The younger Delmar chucked Peter his sandwich, and Peter settled himself at the table which faced the wall, eating his sandwich peacefully for several moments before he was interrupted. There was a shadow that loomed over him, and from the footsteps and the breathing pattern, Peter deduced it was Happy. He kept his back turned to the wall, though. Damn, he really hadn't wanted to explain this to Happy. "Excuse me, can I see your badge?" Happy said with an air of slight menace. Clearly not knowing who he was, and Peter smiled. The head of security was always on the lookout for people who didn't belong. "Happy, chill, it's just me." Peter turned his head and lifted the hat up a bit, whispering. Happy's eyebrows shot up. "Peter?" Happy was incredulous. "What are you doing here? Aren't you supposed to be on your field trip?" "I am on my field trip," Peter explained, much to Happy's confusion. "The field trip is here, so now I'm hiding from all of my employees so I don't get exposed to my class." Happy's face contorted in the way that only Happy's face could do. It was his attempt to keep a serious face, but he couldn't stop his mouth from twitching with laughter. He chuckled. "God, you're as bad as Tony," Peter complained, pulling down his hat so it covered his face. The whole situation was so embarrassing. "I'm sorry, kid, but that is quite funny." Happy smiled. "You're not really lucky, are you?" "No," Peter sighed. "I guess not." "Well, is there anything I can do to facilitate your day, Mr. CEO?" There were so many things Happy could do. He could drive Peter far, far away from the building, or escort Flash out of the building, or just take Peter's place and pretend to be him for the rest of the day, whilst Peter hid out in the comfort of his lab. But none of it was actually possible. Not really. "No, Happy," Peter readjusted his head. "I'm alright." Happy gave his best wishes and continued to interrogate Peter's classmates for their badges. Ned finally arrived, his pizza looking extremely tasty, and they continued with their lunch in peace. Peter let Ned ride him at the museum. It was Peter's fault that the next stop on their tour was research and development, which Kai announced with a smile when everyone had finished their lunch. After all, when the HR department had asked what part of the company he found the most interesting as a teenager, he'd been the one to say the intern labs, so maybe it was karma that Peter's fingers were itching to move when they got to R&D. His favorite department, and cruelly, he couldn't do anything. These were the employees that knew him the most, knew him best. If he spoke or got involved in any of the demonstrations, they would instantly know who he was. That recognition would prove his involvement at Stark. It would have been fine if they treated him just like any of the other interns, but they collectively all shifted to calling him boss rather than Peter, in a situation in which Peter quite clearly, by name, outranked the other interns wasn't one he wanted to explain to his class. But research and development was Peter's baby, and he wanted Ned to at least enjoy some of the demos, so he told Ned to go off by himself and investigate Peter's workplace. Peter, in turn, pretended to look interested in one of the displays about medical bandaging, something that he'd actually personally developed. As it turned out, his chemical mix for his webs was reasonably helpful in the medical field. He wasn't interested in the bandaging, and he would have preferred to be talking to Jasper, who was doing a robot demo. But needs must. He had identities to protect, and this wasn't even about his typical secret identity. "So," came the voice of the one and only Eugene Flash Thompson, and Peter jumped. Peter had kept at the back of the group, as the others had gone up to the interns to ask them questions. Flash, of course, had decided to finally turn his attention to Peter, after having been largely tame for the day, probably because it was the first time he'd properly been alone all day. Peter should have known the blissful lack of attention from his least favorite human wouldn't last. "Where's your desk, penis?" It was obviously an attempt to call him out, but it wasn't going to work. Flash knew about the internship because Peter proclaimed the fact he had an internship at Stark fairly openly. Not that Flash believed him. Flash had spent most of the last 3 years purely making Peter's life miserable with names, insults, and the occasional shove when he didn't get the reaction Flash wanted. Of course, he would wait until they got to what was essentially the intern headquarters before beginning to torment him about his job. "I don't have a desk, Flash." Peter had an office, and, well, the whole building, technically, but no desk. In the intern department, he tended to just co-opt other people's desks. Okay, true, he did have his own little desk in Tony's lab for smaller projects, but most of the time they collaborated on one work surface. Tony had tried to get Peter his own personal lab, but Peter rejected it. He didn't like working on his own. He couldn't do long hours listening to blasting rock music like Tony could, even in the early hours of the morning. It would drive him crazy having his own space, so he'd stuck to basically living in Tony's lab, hence the small desk there. "So you don't work here?" Flash scoffed, staring at Jasper's demonstration. The bot, which had affectionately been named Sir, the interns were very creative. It stood for Stark Industries Robot. Boring. At least Tony had some initiative from Jarvis on Friday. I knew it. Peter looked at the floor. "I do work here." Peter clenched his jaw. "I don't have a desk here, Flash. You're not going to believe me, but I do work here." "Go and join them, penis, if you actually work here." Flash taunted him. "They should welcome you with open arms, right?" Peter was tired of it. They had a month of school left, and Flash was still at it? Seriously, 3 weeks, and then he would never see Flash again. He was certainly never going to get an internship at SI, not when Peter was in charge, not even if he was their best applicant. "Not today, Flash, please." The day had already been hard enough without Flash tormenting him. Peter went to move away from Flash, planning on finding Ned at the robot demo, risking Jasper seeing him, but Flash grabbed his arm and twisted it, smirking. Peter winced. "If you want me to believe you work here, you'll go and work with your supposed colleagues, penis." Peter tried to shake Flash's arm off, still pointedly glaring at the floor. God, he'd love to just have Flash booted out of the building. One text to Happy. "Let him go," came a familiar voice, and no, this could not be happening. Not now, not here. But it was. Peter looked in the mirror of the display and saw Lisa, entering head, with crossed arms staring pointedly at Flash. Peter gulped and turned his head away. Lisa hadn't seen his face, and if he played this well, he could keep it that way. Flash dropped Peter's arm like it was made of ice. "What did you just call that kid?" Lisa asked Flash, clearly appalled. "You are aware we have a very strict no-bullying policy here, kid. What's your name?" Flash looked at the floor and scuffed one of his shoes on the floor. Ignoring Lisa, Peter desperately looked at the floor too, attempting to retain his identity. It had attracted the attention of lots of the interns. Peter could feel the attention on him. He could even hear Flash's heartbeat, which was racing from being publicly called out. Peter's was also beating quickly. He'd been doing so well all day. Of fucking course Flash would be the one to put up a spanner in the works. And he'd been thinking that, just for a second, it would all go well. "Eugene Thompson," Kai said, looking down at the list. Or Flash, as the kid likes to call himself. "Well, Eugene, I think you need to give your classmate an apology." Lisa paused, turning to look at Peter, who was avoiding her. "Who are you, kid?" Shit. Well, there's no getting out of this one, was there? He had no choice. Either belt it out of there and get security called on him, or reveal himself. And he didn't want to be the object of Stark Industries' wild manhunt. Game was up. Peter reluctantly pulled Ned's hat off his head and turned to face the group. There was a collective gasp from several of the employees, their faces shocked, and people started to whisper among themselves. Peter wanted to close his eyes again. "Boss?" Jasper stepped off the demonstration platform, leaving the robot behind. Mr. Harrington glanced at Jasper with a look of surprise. Of course Jasper just had to call him boss. Peter should have disappeared for the duration of the R&D section. He wanted to crawl away and hide in a hole. No, seriously, this wasn't fair. There had to be something up with fate. There was no way all of his field trips could end up in disaster. Peter had single-handedly managed to surprise every single person in the room. Great. "Hi, guys," he smiled in pain. "It was supposed to be my day off, but, well..." He trailed off. What was there to say? There were no words. "Peter!" Lisa had trouble processing, clearly. "Why on earth would you put up with this behavior?" "Lisa, please, it's really not a big deal, honestly." He wanted to downplay as best as possible. Peter had it handled. It was just Flash. He was used to it. "It's a pretty big deal, boss, from what we just saw." Jasper was the most obvious person ever. Great. That was twice his classmates have ever heard Peter being called boss by someone obviously much older than him. Shit. This wasn't good. "Jasper, please." Peter scrunched his eyes tight, then let out a breath. "Really, it's nothing I can't handle." Lisa started speaking again. "Peter, you can't just let him walk around your building." Peter knew how that one ended. It was like the entire R&D department just assumed his senior class knew everything. Like he'd be friends with everyone. "Lisa," Peter cut her off. And Mr. Harrington's mouth fell open in shock from a sharp tone. Right, he was a 17-year-old, abrasively going over an authority figure, who was much older than him. "I've got it handled." He turned to look at Flash. He'd had enough. "Look at me, Flash." Flash reluctantly looked up. "I could get other people to tell you that you're a bully, Mr. Harrington, Principal Moretti, even Lisa, but I don't think I need to. I know bullies, Flash, and I'm sure you have some motivation, some reason. I'm aware of that, sympathetic even, that you feel the need to use violence, but it doesn't excuse it." "I'm sorry," Flash muttered. Wow, the first apology he'd ever given Peter. "I wish we could have worked past this before the end of our high school career, but clearly you don't get it. One apology in 3 years of bullying, 3 years of insults, and I'm sure it's not just me. Don't get me wrong. It's mainly because the school turns a blind eye to this sort of thing, and clearly you've never had anyone tell you that it's wrong to do what you do to me, and probably to other people. But I've had enough, so Peter bit his lip. "I'm going to have to suspend your tour." "Peter," Mr. Harrington said gently, "I know you're frustrated, and it's clearly that you do, in fact, work here, but you can't kick him out of the building." Lisa chuckled cruelly. "Oh, yes, he can." So there was no hope for it then. As Tony had told him, he'd have to own it, be proud of his role, and that wasn't hard because Peter was proud of it. So he dropped his quiet student demeanor and switched to his work one. "I don't want to do this, but I guess I have to." Peter made eye contact with some of his classmates. "So I work here, obviously. You know that. But there's a bit more to it. You'll need to sign NDAs for this, but, Peter clicked some of his fingers. "I'm training to be the next CEO, and I'm currently in charge of the whole building, because Pepper and Tony are on holiday. So yes, Mr. Harrington, actually I can get Flash out of the building if I want to." This was, of course, no surprise to the employees, who all had supportive looks on their faces as the boss basically just shut down his own teacher. Oh God, Peter just pretty much went off at Mr. Harrington, and fuck, he just called Pepper and Tony by their first names in front of all these people. What a car crash. The revelation was, however, a surprise to his class and teacher. No one fainted, but several jaws dropped, not including Ned and MJ, who both had small smiles on their faces. Of course MJ knew already, despite not being told. Peter wouldn't be surprised if she confronted him the next day to ask if he's actually Spider-Man. Ned gave Peter a thumbs up. Mr. Harrington seemed to be in a state of shock, standing perfectly still and staring at him dead in the eyes. As though the idea that one of his students who he taught for years was now the CEO of the company, Peter could understand. He'd, after all, fainted when Tony told him. "Yeah, right," Flash scoffed quietly in the corner, and Peter turned to him. "Have a look if you want." And if he said it with a bit of malice, then fair enough. He thrust his Peter Parker CEO in training badge at Flash, who shook his head in disbelief. Peter was watching as Flash's life was falling apart before his eyes. "What's that?" Mr. Harrington came out of a shock and stepped forward, taking the badge from Flash. "My badge," Peter said. "Any of the employees will corroborate this story. I'm not a liar, Mr. Harrington." Mr. Harrington's eyebrows raised in disbelief. "I'm testifying it to be true. Peter's the boss. He has been all week, and he's great. He's done so many things for his company, and I'm not just talking about the inventions," Jasper stated, a grin on his face. Peter sent him a death glare. He wasn't fishing for compliments, just someone to back up a story. Flash looked like he was going to faint. Lisa followed suit. He started out as Mr. Stark's personal intern. Then he became intern director. And now he's about to take the position of joint CEO. Trust me when I tell you, he's invaluable. Any one of us would happily write a college reference for him, but he's already got certain people to do that for him. "Who did you get to give you a college recommendation?" Betty Brant asked, and Peter felt his face reddening. But he couldn't exactly lie, could he? Mr. Stark?" Betty's eyebrows raised, as did several of his classmates. It hadn't actually set in if Peter was really talking about it. The truth of how crazy it was that Tony Stark, Iron Man, the smartest man alive, probably had written Peter's college recommendation without Peter even asking, as though it had been one of the most important things on his to-do list. It's never too early to start looking at colleges. I've got some pull at MIT. That was one of the first things Tony had said to him, and had rung true. Peter had, after all, been attending MIT lectures for months. He'd practically completed the first year of his degree, which would fast-track his return to SI after college. "And Mrs. Potts, and Dr. Banner, and Captain Rogers," Jasper added. "Don't sell yourself short, Pete." Most of his classmates started to whisper among themselves, and he could feel his face going even more red. But anyways, that wasn't the point of announcing himself. He could kick Flash out of the building. He was in his right to. It was his building, his rules. Flash had tormented him for years, caused him more suffering than many of the villains he'd fought as Spider-Man. Flash Thompson was the bane of his existence. And yet, there was a but, because if he kicked Flash out of the building, it was just retaliation. Peter didn't want this to be a petty fight, like going back and forth. He didn't want to use his power as a CEO to kick a kid out of the building. It seemed like an abuse of his power. Flash, Peter bit his lip. Against my better judgment, I'm going to let you stay, on the promise that from here on out, you'll leave me alone, and won't pick on anyone else. Do we have a deal? That provoked a reaction from the employees. Some frowned, but Peter knew it was the right thing to do. It wouldn't do to punish Flash, even after how much Flash has punished him. Retaliation wasn't worth it. Flash nodded. Lisa touched him on the shoulder. Are you sure, Peter? Yeah, Lisa, it's the right thing to do, he whispered back. All right, people, back to your demonstrations. They spent another half an hour in research and development. Peter himself did some of the demonstrations to his classmates, and then wandered around helping some of the other interns. Watching as his peers freaked out at him interacting with all of the interns, completely at ease, he was in his element. When the group was finished with all the wonders of research and development, Peter moved them on their way. Okay, Kai, let's go. Peter smiled. Okay, maybe this is going to be fun. He could answer questions, help the tour, basically show off to everyone. Maybe it had been a good call to reveal himself to them. Slowly, as they walked the corridors, Peter discussed several things with Kai. Most of his classmates didn't understand what they were talking about. Something about hiring a new deputy, after the last one had gone wrong. Now, most tours wouldn't have this privilege, but because you guys are with me, I'm going to allow it, Peter said, smiling as they went to the elevator. We're going to see a couple of the personal labs. He planned to show them Bruce's lab, because it was so cool and would totally please the chemistry students, and maybe even Tony's. Bruce's lab was almost as cool as Tony's. Whilst Tony was more focused around engineering, with scrap projects and pieces of metal everywhere, Bruce's was largely more chemical-based. Of course, he had a whole section of lab dedicated to studies of radioactivity, but Peter's favorite was the wall of the periodic table, where Bruce stored the various chemicals, normally in their elemental form if it was safe, and if not, then a compound of some sort, in the correct place on the table. The class awed and gasped as they saw some of the experiments that were taking place. Bruce wasn't in the lab, but he often left experiments ongoing, as some of them took days to form a reaction, which greatly amused the class. No photos here, Peter quickly added, as he saw some people getting out their phones. It'll go into your NDA. Tony's lab was one of the highest floors, and so Peter asked Friday to take them there, overstepping the boundaries of the temporary passes his classmates had been given. Peter didn't let them go into Tony's lab, but he did point out several things. Tony had at least cleaned up his lab before he'd gone on holiday. Dummy and you, Tony's two bots, were sat sadly without anyone to entertain. Many of his classmates asked him details about certain things in Tony's lab, and Peter was more than happy to elaborate, as well as give them the stories about projects gone wrong in the lab. After the labs, the next stop, according to Kai, was a talk at AMP, where one of the team would be giving them a talk about Stark phones. Peter knew it would interest several of the more engineering-focused classmates, so he was going to accompany them to their talk. But, alas, duty called. His phone rang, the screen display coming up with a number he vaguely recognized but didn't want to believe was true. Not today, of all days. Are you fucking kidding me? Peter muttered as they looked at his phone, sparking concern from Ned, who glanced at his friend. Friday? It's the Vice President, Peter. I'm afraid. I think he wants you to change your mind about the military weapons supply again. The Vice President? One of his classmates said, stunned. Peter ignored the surprise. Christ, I was hoping to go 6 months before hearing his voice again, Peter complained. The rest of the class looked shocked, but hey, there weren't that many more surprises that he could give. Him calling the Vice President was probably one of the most minor reveals he'd made today. Right, guys. I have to take this call, unfortunately, but I'll be back in 5. Kai, I'll meet you down at AMP. Dr. Walters will be waiting there. Kai nodded and went to lead away the tour group back into the elevator. Peter accepted the call and began to pace around the room. Mr. Adams, I was under the impression we had an agreement. The class heard Peter hiss as the elevator doors closed. It turned out the Vice President had wanted to call, with him not to be a pain in the ass, but more so to inform Peter that the President was looking to talk to one of the CEOs ASAP. Peter deliberated taking the call, and then told the vice president he was actually off duty and would get back to the president the next day, feeling extremely cool as he did so. After that, he got Friday to speed him down to the assembly and production unit. "What did the vice president want?" Ned asked boldly when Peter arrived. "Oh, you know," Peter waved vaguely. "He wanted me to talk to the president, but I told him I'd do it tomorrow." "You told the vice president," Ned paused, taking it in, "that you couldn't speak to the actual president because you're busy?" "Well, I did have a field trip to help lead." Peter grinned. Ned punched him in the arm. "You're an idiot," MJ proclaimed. "But also, that's iconic." "It's okay. Tony would have done the same thing." "Really, that's why he did it. He essentially hung up on the president. Tony would find that hilarious." The class thoroughly enjoyed the talk from Dr. Walters, who was more than happy to answer their burning questions about the Stark phones. Kai looked relieved that he didn't have to answer any more questions and could instead just sit and listen to the talk. And after that, it was time for the tour group to leave. Well, they had one more thing to do. After sitting all the students and Dr. Harrington down with Andrew McGuire, head of the legal team, Peter calmly explained to them what an NDA was and what it entailed. "Listen to me, all of you. This applies verbally, in writing, and even on social media. If my lawyers get one hint that someone has leaked this on Twitter, even anonymously, then there will be serious repercussions. Honestly, I'd prefer we didn't have to do this, and it really wasn't what I was intending from today. But hey, shit happens." Peter passed out the papers and watched as everyone signed them. He then got McGuire to take them back up to legal and put them in storage. "Please, guys, I know it just seems like a bit of paper to you, but this is my life. If any one of you say anything—" Peter made eye contact with several of them. "It will get bad, and people will probably come asking for an interview with you. I can't force you not to do it, but I am asking you to say no. After graduation, we're making this go public, but I implore you, please stay away from the press. One of them nearly shot me." Peter witnessed as several faces turned extremely alarmed, and he immediately backtracked. "But we probably shouldn't go there. Yeah. Please take care of yourselves." Peter escorted them to the exit of Stark Industries, waving a hand to Will. He leaned on the doorframe as Mr. Harrington beckoned him to come with the rest of the tour group. "You have to come back to school with us, Peter," Mr. Harrington stated, gesturing with his hand towards the coach. "Mr. Harrington, with all due respect, then I would just have to get the head of security to come and pick me up to drive me back here." Peter winced. "I really don't want to make him annoyed on a Wednesday evening." "You're living here? At the tower?" Somehow, Peter's teacher was still surprised by the revelation, even though it was a fairly obvious deduction from Peter's decision to stay at the tower. "Yep," Peter said, pointing up to the top of the tower. "In the penthouse. I'm working here this week, so we figured it made more sense than staying in Queens. Someone has to feed the fish in the evening as well, so—" He shrugged like it was a normality, and it was becoming that. The penthouse was his second home. "Do you live here all the time? I thought— Who is your guardian?" "No, I live with my aunt normally, and she's one of my guardians, but I live here occasionally, when I want to, or when it's more convenient, I guess. Well, Mr. Stark is the other guardian. Didn't you see the paper on the field?" "That was, Peter scratched the back of his neck. "My permission slip for the week off, I guess." "Right," Mr. Harrington said, gazed. "Well, I guess it doesn't make any sense for you to come back with us after you explained it like that." "Perfect," Peter said, doling out a false smile. "I'll see you on Monday. Take care." It was like he was kicking them out of his house after spending the entire evening entertaining and cooking dinner for them. That was actually what it felt like, too. When Peter closed the door, he let out a loud sigh. "That bad, boss?" Will demanded, logging off from his computer. "Don't even ask, Will." Peter ran a hand over his face. "Don't even ask." Peter made his way back up to the tower and collapsed on the sofa. He pulled his phone out and called Tony. He didn't even know what time it would be where Tony was, but hell, the man was probably awake. "Hey, kiddo, how you doing?" Tony asked. I've been better." Peter put Tony on speakerphone and rested the phone on his chest. He then put his hand over his face. "What happened?" "I had to tell them. I don't want to talk about it, but they all signed NDAs. I'm sorry, Tesoro. I know you didn't want to have to do that." That was another new development. Tony had started using Italian nicknames, Tesoro, Bambino. It was a little like Tony calling him my kid. It made Peter feel all warm inside. Tony was just such a dad. "It's okay," Peter smiled. They were going to have to find out eventually. It was just embarrassing. I thought I could have gotten away with just being an intern, but Jasper kept calling me boss, so that plan went out of the way. Well, I'm proud of you. Did the rest of it go smoothly? Did you like the museum? Tony clearly was grinning at that. I had no idea my suit was in there. It was so cool. The pair spoke a bit more about the day. Tony found it hilarious that Peter had put the president himself on hold, and cheered when he heard that Happy had thought Peter had been an intruder because of his hat. Peter ended the day with patrol, which was mainly spent swinging around Queens. Crime had decided to sleep on that Wednesday, and it was a blessing. He went home earlier than he normally would from a Spider-Man trip, and then collapsed into his bed, ready for the next day. Thursday and Friday were as uneventful as Monday. It appeared that his days just fused into 2 days of somewhat stress, but then left him alone for most of the days. He kept up his routine: breakfast, news in the lab, solving problems, and attending boring meetings. By Friday, he felt quite well versed, quite set in the routine. Maybe, if he was bored over the summer, he'd spend a couple more days taking on an actual CEO role, just maybe. Tony and Pepper returned from their vacation, both looking tanned and significantly less stressed than they had before the trip. They thanked Peter, and when Tony had asked what Peter wanted, Peter had just asked for a lab session. He didn't want a gift he wouldn't use or a private plane. At least, not for another few years anyway. Peter would much rather spend time in the lab with his mentor, his dad, for all intents and purposes. They hadn't had that chat, but they had graduated up to more and more hugs. Ever since Tony had embraced him in a bear hug when Peter finally told him all about the details about Flash. Tony knew the details. He knew that Peter and Flash had semi-made up. And it was true. Flash had been better in the last several weeks, as though being publicly shamed had actually improved his behavior. But Peter had still laughed when Tony had suggested that he should go kill Flash, after hearing about one particular incident in the gym class where Peter had emerged with a large bruise on his face. He'd never explained it to the nurse, passing it off as just an incident with the basketball, but there were a few ways to explain away a punch from your bully to people who knew him, who noticed. The black guy had taken weeks to fully heal. It had been pre-spider bite. No, Flash wasn't a threat anymore, but there was something that kept Peter awake at night, and that was the announcement that was soon to be held at Stark Industries in one of the conference rooms, the same room as the intern fair he had arranged with that employee from HR many months ago. It was going public, on record, as heir to Stark Industries and future CEO. Peter was fairly well versed in secret identities. He'd spent years as Spider-Man with a mask on, triple-checking places before he would pull his mask off, worrying about who to trust and what to say about certain people. He was well versed, too, in keeping his Peter Parker life fairly secret. Despite all the publicity that should have found him by now, he'd been exceedingly lucky that none of the Stark employees nor his classmates had decided to break their NDAs and other contracts to reveal Peter's identity as heir to the company. It was probably with the knowledge of the wrath that would follow from Pepper for revealing the identity of a minor. Everyone, after all, wanted to keep their jobs and get an education. What Peter wasn't well versed in was how to take that mask off, how to reveal his identity to a world where the spotlight would be thrust on him. It was the day of the announcement, the day Peter Parker would become known to the world as the heir to Stark Industries, as joint CEO with Pepper. Hi, my name is Peter Parker, and, as Mr. Stark just told you all, Peter stared at himself in the mirror, trying desperately to keep his brain off. He had 1,000 texts from Ned and MJ, both of whom were sending extremely supportive messages and thumbs-up emojis. They'd been invited to come by Pepper and Tony, but Peter had said it was something he should do by himself. May, too, had remained at the apartment, despite her protestations. Peter didn't want her to be a premature target of questions. It was best to keep the people he loved out of it. Peter smiled at some of the gifts of cats that MJ had sent to try and soothe him. There was even the photo of him as Spider-Man with the cat from that time he'd been photographed. That was another development. After some coaching from Tony about how to pick up a girl, and then corrected coaching from Pepper, Peter had asked MJ out. They'd been on 2 dates, and Peter grinned every time he thought about it. Hopefully, the unfortunate fame that came with being Tony Stark's heir wouldn't put her off, but he didn't think she'd care. He knew there would be backlash, there would be deep dives into his history, people scouring his life, classmates being interviewed, old friends of his parents giving details he didn't want to be exposed to the public. Probably some false rumors of him being Tony's child, because that's where everyone's brain went. Even Flash, who had got the balls to ask Peter 3 days before graduation whether he was actually Tony's biological son. There would be problems that arose from the press conference, questions that would need to be asked, but hey, he was Peter Parker. He'd been through a hell of a lot more than some snarky reporters. But Peter felt ready. It had only been a few weeks since the field trip, but something had vitally changed since it, and his week alone at Stark Industries. He'd stopped being scared of the idea of being Heir, stopped feeling faint when he thought of the company being his to control, his to make decisions for, without any authorization. Peter had changed from the kid who couldn't comprehend being an intern. He'd graduated high school, got a girlfriend who knew about him being the Heir, and about him being Spider-Man, and he stood up to his bully. He was still bricking it, though, just thinking about his speech after Tony made the announcement. Hi, my name is Peter Parker, and as Mrs. Stark just told you all, brave as he could possibly try to be, he donned his favorite suit, a classic black jacket and white tee, and did several checks in the mirror. Was his hair out of place? No, it was fine. Or at least, as fine as it could be. Was there anything in his teeth from breakfast? No, nothing. Fine. Could he still smile and speak without shaking like a leaf? Yes, but he didn't have a strong grip on either of those abilities at the moment. And then he exited the bathroom and walked out into Tony's penthouse, right at the top of the building. They'd agreed as a trio that it would be better for him to spend the night at the building, to avoid the press as they flocked to SI for the announcement, and to settle his jitters. Tony and Pepper met him with award-winning smiles, both looking equally done up. Tony wore a similar black and white suit to Peter's. They had the same tailor now, which is only going to exasperate the whole sun theory. Pepper wore a stunning dark blue dress. Hi, guys, Peter said a bit shakily. It's going to be fine, Pete, Tony reminded him, pulling Peter into a hug. He whispered into Peter's ear reassurance. It's going to be great. You're great. Thanks. Peter smiled into the hug. They made their way down to the conference hall, one powerful trio in the elevator. Freddy, of course, fast-tracked them straight there. Peter was clicking his fingers one at a time. Tony made a couple of light comments about the press individuals who were there, giving Peter some tips, but he was sort of spaced out, in his prepping mode like he used to do for any group presentation or big meeting. Spend 5 minutes not talking, just running it over in his mind. Hi, my name is Peter Parker, and as Mr. Stark just told you all. When they arrived in the hall, Peter pulled Tony aside before they went in. Tony, Peter bit his lip. I'm nervous. I know, Tony nodded. It's okay, they're not expecting you to be perfect. They're not expecting anything, honestly. I'll keep the focus on me if I think you're losing it. I'll just pretend to faint and fall off the stairs. And then you can run out if you want to. Just give me a thumbs down sneakily, and that's the plan. Or a code word? He mused. Tony... Peter raised his eyebrows, but had to try really hard to suppress the smile that was sneaking through onto his face. Okay, but honestly, just give me the word and it's over, kiddo. Thanks, Peter sighed. Let's do this. He wasn't ready for the excessive flashing of cameras when he emerged with Tony and Pepper, but he ignored them and sat down at the press table. The first bit was up to Tony. Thank you all for getting here today. As stated previously, we have an announcement to make about the future of Stark Industries. Tony took a moment to stare at some of the journalists with the air of intimidation. This is Peter Parker. He is our current intern director, and his other official role is CEO in training. Because this is the future Peter Parker who will be my heir to Stark Industries. I will now let him introduce himself. Tony smiled encouragingly and looked at Peter. Hi, my name is Peter Parker. Peter stared out into the crowd and then continued. And, as Mrs. Stark just told you all, I'm going to be CEO of Stark Industries. I wanted to introduce myself to you and all. And so he continued, occasionally reminding himself of what he wanted to say by looking at the little flashcards he had prepared. Both Tony and Pepper kept shooting him reassuring glances and thumbs up. Thank you. Peter let out a small breath as he came to the end of his speech and smiled. Several cameras from the back of the room flashed. He desperately hoped his hair wasn't messed up. As the crowd realized he was finished, there was a flurry of questions. Reporters pushing their microphones closer to hear his answer. What colleges are you considering, Mr. Parker? Peter, are you actually Tony's son? Peter had to stop himself from raising his eyebrows. Wow, that hadn't taken long. Tony stood up from his seat at that one, shaking his head rapidly and standing next to Peter. Don't say anything, Tony whispered, and Peter nodded. Message received. He hadn't been planning on it anyways. Peter, are you dating anyone right now? Peter couldn't stop his eyebrows from shooting up in surprise. Whoa, what an invasion of privacy. Thankfully, Tony stepped in. And we're not taking questions for Peter at this time. Thank you, Tony said, whisking him away. They exited the conference room, ignoring the flurry of questions and noise as they left. Peter kept his eyes shielded away from the cameras as he left. When they got out of sight, Tony pulled him into the biggest hug Peter had ever received from anyone. "I'm so proud of you, Bambino," Tony said whilst Peter was encased in a hug, and it reverberated through Peter's body with warmth. "I'm so proud of you." Peter was going to melt. And with that, it was over. The news is out. Peter Parker was the heir to Stark Industries. The announcement had been made. The employees of Stark Industries knew. His classmates knew. The press knew. Everyone knew that Peter Parker was the heir. And most importantly, Peter knew he was the heir. Alright guys, and that is the end of Heir to Stark Industries by Only Forward. I hope you guys liked it, and I'll see you next video.